Today, is Australia doomed? Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, world latest post covering finance and property news. I'm joined by Tarek Brooker today for our regular Friday afternoon chat. Tarek, hello. It's doom and gloom, I'm afraid, but there's a reason for it, isn't there?
There is, there's all, well, and it's coming from some unlikely places too. I mean, you've got some of the senior folks at NAB talking about basically how the economy is going to be stalled until we can really fix productivity growth. You've got the numbers from the Centre for Population, which shows that, well, they project that Australian fertility rates are going to fall below that of where Japan was in the 2010s, and well, oh boy, we've got some problems.
Yes, and of course, we had the data this week relating both to wages growth, which was somewhat slower, although expected, and of course, the employment numbers, which suggest that the economy is flat out, burnout economy once again. So all of those things are in. But it's fascinating to me that Albo came out this week and blamed us economists. We've caused the problem.
Yes, it's social media and it's the information that's being brought to the table. It's rather astounding, but it's also on brand. Like what we've seen from the government is like the suppression of the move to suppress dissent, and you kind of get the feeling that Albert just doesn't really like being criticized. And I think that, for people like you and I and the viewers, we tend to look at things through a relatively data-driven lens. And, as we'll show in some of the slides later, things have been unfavorable for a long time here in Australia for a lot of people. And unfortunately, under the Albanese government, that already unfavorable trend has become, well, even more unfavorable.
Yes, and even Phil Lowe threw a big rock at Chalmers this week as well, which Chalmers didn't like either, right? So there's a real question, I think, and we've spoken before about this gap between perception and reality, and the gap between what the politicians want you to look at through misdirection, what they want you to believe through the way that they spin their stories, spin gin and all that, and reality. And the point is that once you start seeing the constellation of data that's out there, and you start putting it together, as you and I both do, the story that you get, one, is consistent. Two, as you say, it's a long-term issue. This is not something that's just been created in the last 6 months or the last year, right? There's a set of trends that when you stand back and think about them would suggest, well, actually, Australia, you've got a whole bunch of policy settings wrong, and the consequences are dramatically bad for a considerable portion of the population. And yet, the politicians don't want you really to actually recognize that and say, no, we're doing everything. We're alleviating cost of living, and we're doing this, we're doing that, but actually when you stand back and look at the data, it tells a different story.
It absolutely does. And I think the thing is that the data that we have, and that we'll get into later in some of the slides, it already paints a very, very concerning picture. A level for some, age demographics, you're talking a technical depression level bad. But the problem is that in and of itself is only just an aggregate figure. What it completely misses out on is all these people who are, for example, doing better, who are, for example, getting inheritances, or they're getting better educated than their demographic predecessors, who are doing a lot better than they used to be, which statistically means that there's a whole bunch of other people who are falling behind even more than that data suggests. And that is a very, very worrying thing, not only from an economic perspective, but from a social perspective, and just from a, social fabric viewpoint of just, of everyone feeling like they have a stake in, the continued existence of our country, the continued existence of our system.
Yeah, and so 2 points. One is, I always say, averages mask. So, if you look at average income or average household wealth, that doesn't tell you anything about the so-called dispersion. So if you look at the distribution of that, then how many households are actually doing really well versus not? And Same with mortgage stress. Not everybody's in mortgage stress, but there's a significant cohort that is, or rental stress, the same. And it does seem to me that sometimes politicians in particular go for those nice, comfortable averages. Well, incomes are higher. Jim says more than 3%. That's good growth. No, you've got to look at it in context, right? And you've got to look at it public sector, private sector, all of those things to try and actually work at what's going on. So having to drill down into the more granular information and to actually unpick it and to then tell a story about it is, I think, the critical skill at the moment. Then, of course, some of those in power prefer we didn't talk about this stuff and are trying to dial back freedom of expression on the social media channels. So there's a real gap. But anyway, we should get into our data. Tarek, you've done some great work recently. And yeah, it is a really, really fascinating time. And I guess the starting point for this is this is a lovely one.
Yeah, I thought this was rather apt considering the title of today's videos, and sort of some of the data pointing at where we seem to be heading. As usual, the charts can be found at burnouteconomics.com. They're already posted up there live. If you would like to subscribe and support my work, or even if you just like to subscribe to my YouTube channel, which has some clips from here and shortly from elsewhere, that would be great. There's links of both of those in the description. So we're going to get straight into it. Now, what we're going to be looking at today in quite a few slides is the demographic future of Australia based on its fertility rate and why this is playing out. Now, what we've got here is Australia's fertility rate since 2000, and what we've tacked on there at the end are the numbers from the federal government Centre for Population on where it believes the fertility rate is going to go in 2025 and 2026. And what it's charted against here is Japan's, because Japan, despite some others overtaking it in terms of the deterioration in fertility rates, is still the sort of poster child for that particular issue. And as you can see here, if the Centre for Population's numbers end up coming to fruition, Australia will have a lower fertility rate in 2026 than Japan did in 2017. And that is, quite a striking set of numbers, considering the fact that Australia's fertility rate was getting relatively close to replacement as late as 2008. But as we're going to show from some of the other slides in today's numbers, a lot of things started going wrong from 2008 onwards.
Well, let's just be clear. When we talk about fertility rates, what we're talking about is effectively the natural replacement rate. So, people fall off the perch, new people are born, and the question is, what's the relationship between all of that? And particularly, if you think about what replacement rates we need to actually maintain the steady growth of the population, then it needs to be sort of around 2-ish, right, rather than much lower. So it's a really important metric. And it's internationally, I think, used quite rightly as an anchor point for social policy.
Indeed. I mean, and just to clarify, TFR is basically total fertility rate, which is basically, put somewhat more crudely, is babies per woman in the relevant age demographic, and at this particular snapshot in time. So it really, I think the thing is that there's nothing inherently wrong with a fertility rate below replacement, which is roughly considered 2.1 by academia, but it's about the level below 2.1 as to how things are going to play out. At, say, for example, at 1.4, 100 people becomes and 100 people in one generation becomes 70 people in the next generation, and then it shrinks, so on and so forth, in that particular fashion. So you end up with a situation where you're going to be, where if this level of deterioration becomes the norm and becomes entrenched, where we're going to be confronting something akin to a demographic wall, whereby we're not going to have the people coming through to replace the people who are passing away are not really the issue, because the government isn't going to be paying for them. It's the people who are older, we have created this system whereby, we pay for their aged care, we pay for their health care, we pay for their pensions. And, all of those things are getting increasingly expensive, both publicly and privately. So it's important to have what some demographers call a glide path. You know, so maybe the fertility rate's at 1.7, 1.8, 1.9. So yes, obviously the generation's going to be smaller, but it's not so dramatically smaller that you're going to end up with a situation similar to, say, South Korea, where you're going to end up with a working age population burdened by an enormous, an enormous number of elderly people. So, it's potentially going to force some rather, challenging choices in time. But it is one thing that is worth noting in this particular context is that these choices, even with the challenges we now face, is still a long way away.
Mm.
You're talking about something that's not gonna come to fruition for realistically another couple of decades. Australia's population, going by the ABS estimates, depending on whether you go with the low, medium, or high growth estimates in terms of their fertility rate numbers, you're realistically talking about natural population growth, births minus deaths, rounding out of somewhere in the sort of 2040s to 2050s, depending on your number in question. So it's still something that is a while away, but it's something that you want to address in the here and now before it becomes a big problem, before you end up like Japan or South Korea with an entrenched demographic issue.
And I guess this also, to an extent, contextualizes the immigration debate, because what's actually been happening, particularly in the last few years, is a significant rise in migration to offset this fall away in terms of fertility. And what that actually means is that we have a different mix of people in society, coming from different places, as we've always done in Australia. And the discussion, of course, is, well, if you actually have homegrown population growth, well, you can plan for that, because by definition, you know when babies land, and you know when they're going to need school, etc., etc. So it gives you a longer perspective. Whereas, in fact, if you have high migration and it comes quickly, as we've seen, then there's just not a chance to react in terms of policy settings, and therefore we have all of these jammed up roads, and we have home problems with, no where to live, or high rents, or big mortgages and high home prices. So there are profound consequences of these demographic shifts. But as you say, they're quite often down the road. And my sense sometimes is that politicians will think, well, that's not going to happen all on my watch, so maybe I don't need to care too much.
Well, it's interesting just talking about the demographics. I'm just going to skip through to one of the slides that's later on, because this is rather relevant. This charts the relative growth of the population of Australia against India since 2000. Now, obviously, India is very much a poster child for population growth. It is now the most populous nation in the world. It is also, seen as a nation that faces some challenges with its population, because it needs to build additional infrastructure. It needs to be able to house all these people, to feed all these people. And, the Indian government has made a great deal of commentary on that, on the importance of confronting these issues. But little old Australia down here in the Southwest Pacific is growing faster. Of the economies in the OECD database, of the major economies, I should say, only one nation is growing faster than Australia, and that is Israel. Aside from that, Australia is then head and shoulders above the rest, which does include some developing nations such as India. And we are just pursuing such a level of population growth that it is very, very challenging for services, for infrastructure, for housing to keep up with, despite the fact that we do very well when it comes to things like building homes.
That's really interesting, and I hadn't appreciated that we were even faster than India, which is, and if you think about the economic parameters of India and where they're headed and what they're doing versus what we're doing here, there are some profound differences, which I find quite fascinating. But I suppose it's interesting also to take the conversation slightly further, because, of course, if you think about when people tend to have kids, It's not universally spread across all age groups, is it? There are some focus areas we need to go into.
No, absolutely, and that is where this chart comes in and is very interesting. Now, what I've charted here, thanks very kindly to the RBA who put me onto this data, is Australia's fertility rate balanced to 100 versus real per capita spending for the 25 to 34 age demographic. Now, for better or worse, that is the demographic that is defining for a nation's fertility rate. Yes, people who are older than that can have children and increasingly are having children, but that is, statistically speaking, where the bulk of children come to parents in that particular age demographic. And as you can see here, both of them peaked in 2008, and both of them have declined significantly since. And I think that just speaks to the stalling of outcomes for Australian households in those younger and, vital childbearing age demographics.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. Interestingly, of course, if you look at the mortgage stress data, guess which cohort is right up there? It's this same cohort. So they're having difficulty in finding somewhere to live or affording to find somewhere to live. Assessments of mortgages are now done on 2 full-time incomes rather than 1 and a bit, which is what it used to be. And so what it tells me is that they can't afford to actually have kids. They can't afford, in some cases, to even go into household formation until a lot later. So they tend to do it later than previously. So all of those things are coming together. And that chart really shows you one of the consequences.
No, absolutely. And I think part of the thing as well is that this data stops before the real inflation the real inflation in terms of the CPI really starts to bite later in 2022 and into 2023. And it just speaks to the severity of the challenges that young people are facing. And the thing is that if you go back through, say, for example, growth in household consumption per capita, right? If you go back far enough and you try and find an analog in the data going back through, I think it goes back to the 1970s, there isn't one. And I would wager that if you even had data for the entire post-war period, you wouldn't find another analog where people went backwards this much for this long. I suspect you would have to go all the way back to the Depression to find something that is an analog to this. Now, obviously, the Depression was worse, but there's just nothing else in more modern history of Australia, I should say, that is close to resembling this. Now, don't get me wrong, there's been recessions, there's been some very challenging times. There's the oil crisis, there's the 1983 recession, there's the 1990-91 recession, where unemployment reached over 10%, unemployment went over 10%. But in none of those instances was the damage that was done to household consumption sustained like it has been since the financial crisis for Australia's younger demographics.
Yeah, Tarek, that's a really, really interesting point. And I guess if I think of it from a political perspective, I'm not sure that many of those in positions of power actually really want to get into the weeds here to understand the consequences of all of this.
No, I don't think they do. I think the thing is that this is filtering through the demographic worm. Like there are people now, say, for example, in the younger Gen X cohort in particular, people who haven't managed to make the leap to home ownership, people who, they came in, just too late after housing prices started to take off in the 2000s. Maybe they faced some other challenges in their life, or it's just simply a case of just, the market continuing to get away from them. It's not an uncommon scenario, unfortunately. But it's these people who now look at the system, who now look at the two-party preferred nature of Australian politics and are just saying no. Like, One Nation, for example, is disproportionately present in renters in those sort of older, not older, in the, the Gen X demographic.
Mm.
And I would imagine that if you looked at the data at a granular level, I would imagine that you would see that in the elder millennial demographics as well, because the eldest member of Gen Y is going to be what, 45, 46 this year. These are not people who are, you know, who, I mean, they're sort of eternally seen as the, the teenagers or the people in their 20s sitting around playing video games. But the reality is that, these people are now well and truly in demographics who should be owning their own homes. But we're seeing, well, as we'll see even a little bit later, that this is just filtering through the worm in terms of people just not making it even to having their own household, let alone owning their own home.
Yes, and I'm fascinated. The most recent poll, I think, was South Australia. And, One Nation came out there really, really strong. And I make the observation that the pressures on households in South Australia in terms of housing affordability and mortgage stress have gone absolutely through the roof. And I'm seeing a lot of people in my surveys completely frustrated with the major parties and their inability to do anything about it. So I don't know whether the vote for One Nation potentially is more a vote against the other guys rather than for One Nation, or whether, in fact, people are more aligned to One Nation policies. But certainly in my surveys, I'm seeing a lot of people who are completely frustrated with the way that the political system is working at the moment and the way that it's translated into how people are living their lives and what they've got to do. And that does actually beg some really interesting questions from a political perspective when you think about the coming election cycle and the shenanigans on the conservative side of politics and the neoliberals now back in charge of the Liberal Party. And there's a massive gap, in my view, again, between the political discourse and the issues that real ordinary people are trying to get their heads around.
No, indeed. I think in some ways the issues facing South Australia and Adelaide in particular are somewhat overlooked because I don't think they're as well understood as they perhaps should be. Now, CoreLogic, or as they're known these days, Cotality, put out a report late last year, their housing affordability report, which was very important because it actually looked not at the picture for Adelaide from the perspective of national household incomes, but from household incomes at a local level within Adelaide itself. And that that changed the picture painted there to one that was even more favorable than the already horrible one using aggregate national data. Adelaide is, in terms of its houses, it is the second most expensive market relative to incomes in Australia. By a fairly decent margin at that. And I think that just speaks to the issues that a lot of people are facing. I believe that for the most part, the increase in the One Nation primary vote of something like 20 percentage points since the last election, depending on which poll you want to choose as your frame of reference. I mean, and not only that, but much of it's occurred since late last year. And I doubt that what we've seen is a surge of millions upon millions of Australians going through the One Nation's policy book and saying, yes, that's for me. Now, don't get me wrong, there are some people like that, but I imagine that for a lot of people, it's a vote against the current system, against both of the major parties. And although, to be completely honest with you, it's in some ways it's on brand for Australia because it is said that we're not a nation that votes a government in; we're a nation that votes governments out.
Yeah, well, I think that's very true. And interestingly, if I look at the proportion of net disposable income going on housing, and if I look at across each of the major locations, it's become more adverse in Adelaide than almost anywhere else. It's in the same category as some of the worst areas of Western Sydney now, and that never used to be the case. So you can see how these policies have actually drifted through and are creating real life issues for people in terms of, well, I'm not going to have kids because I can't afford to have kids. And I suppose the other angle of looking at it is looking at where people are actually spending as well, because the other fascinating piece of data, and in fact, you've got a chart on it, which we'll move to now, is showing that the real consumer spending growth is massively distorted by the age demographic.
Absolutely. Now, this data is from Combank IQ, who were kind enough to share the underlying numbers with me over the years, and it shows what's real spending. So this is inflation adjusted spending looks like, excluding housing, since the start of their particular data series, and it really just shows just how distorted things have become. At one end of the spectrum, you've got the 75 and over demographic who are doing brilliantly. Now, the sort of growth that they're seeing in their spending is akin to boom times for when, disposable incomes were seeing stonking growth in the late 1990s and the early 2000s. Whereas for people, in particular, 25 to 29 and the 30 to 34 age demographics, they're going backwards, and rather strongly. And just to circle back around to what you were saying previously about the burden of the cost of housing and how that impacts fertility rates and stuff. There's some great data on this from the ABS, which breaks down fertility rates by local government area. So you can look at these local government areas that were once affordable. Places like the New South Wales Central Coast, up past Barara and south of Newcastle, that were once bastions for Sydney-siders, particularly younger Sydney-siders, who wanted to have children, who wanted to have their own home, who then moved to these places in order to do that. And you could see how much stronger the fertility rates were in those places than they were in Sydney proper. And you've seen that repeated in even in places like Melbourne as well. But now Australia faces this issue that there aren't no, not that there are none, but the number of bastions to escape to for people from expensive places like Sydney and Melbourne, they're gone. Brisbane is now as expensive as Melbourne. So is Adelaide. Perth is almost there. And, there's all these regional areas that people used to be able to go to and buy a house for something that was still, by global standards, a very, very expensive house relative to incomes. But for Australia, much, much cheaper than the capitals, where you could still buy a house for 4 times household income from your city, or maybe 5. Whereas now you look at some of our major regional centres, and you're talking about some of these regional centres being 8 or 9 times median household income. And that is just absolutely wild. So there's no escape anymore. And I think as this feeds into the picture of fertility rates over time, because obviously there's a lag to all these things, because people tend to get established, then have children, not the other way around. So as that continues to feed into things over time, I think that the Centre for Population's projections of fertility rates bouncing back, I think they're a bit of a fantasy, to be completely honest with you. I think that maybe you might see a bit of a bounce here and there, but as the lagged impact of all these things feeds into the data over time, unfortunately, I fear things are going to get significantly worse before they get significantly better.
Yes, well, the housing affordability issue is significant. I make the note, just to comment here, that CBA, of course, does produce their housing affordability data sets, and it's showing it's extremely adverse. But it is worth noting, as I said earlier on, that they now assume 2 full-time incomes when they calculate housing affordability. Now, if you go back a decade or so, no one did that when they calculated housing affordability. So the ground has shifted. The assumption now is that you need 2 full-time incomes, which of course then builds a big question about childcare, which is another factor in terms of fertility. Because if you have to go straight back to work, that costs a lot in child. Now, I know that Albo's trying to do some stuff in terms of subsidising childcare, but it's still a huge cost. And that is a really interesting observation, because you then got to ask the question, well, okay, if you do decide to bring up kids and you've both got to go out to work and you have to work long hours to be able to actually generate sufficient income to be able to actually pay all the bills, what is the quality of life that you've got, and what is the quality of life that the kids have too? Because I do think there's a quality of life question as well as a affordability question.
No, absolutely. I mean, to to again quote from the CoreLogic affordability report, like their data set starts at towards the end of 2001. Now, don't get me wrong, by then housing prices had already taken off in 2000 and earlier in 2001. That encompasses the largest real increase in Australian housing prices in history. Well, in the history of the current data sets anyway, which I think go back to the 70s. And the thing is, in 2001, even after housing prices had already taken off somewhat, you could, on a median national household income, which I might add obviously encompassed a lot fewer a lot fewer households with multiple people working. Back then, you could buy the median house nationally, and it was under 25% of median household income to service that mortgage. Today, which their data, I believe, covers up till the end of the September quarter of last year, it's now 48%.
Yep.
So, you're talking about, depending on the makeup of a household's earnings capacity, I mean, you're talking in some cases about like 70 or 8 or even 80% of the take home being consumed by the mortgage. And that's if the bank's going to give you that sort of mortgage in the first place, which is a big question mark.
Absolutely. Well, I do highlight the fact that the banks are being quite flexible at the moment with their lending policy. So I'm still seeing some new loans being written at 7, 8, 9 times for own occupation, a little bit less so for investors now. But what it does mean is that people are actually stepping into huge levels of debt quite early on, which again then comes right back to this question of, well, yeah, we're going to actually hopefully get somewhere to live, but that means we're going to have to work a lot harder, which means we can't have kids for a lot longer and a lot later and all of those things. I guess the other way to think about it, Tarek, if you talk about this particular cohort that we've been looking at, what's the consequences of how many people are we missing?
Yeah, no, that's a really important point. Now, what I've done here with this particular chart is I've taken the data from the ABS and I've calculated the ratio of the number of households stemming from each age demographic. Now, this particular analysis focuses on the 25 to 34 age demographic yet again. And basically, in 2003, 2004, based on the available data from the ABS, that is when there was the peak number of households per 100,000 people in that particular age demographic. Since then, it has deteriorated rather severely. And there are now about over three. This is only, unfortunately, the ABS data set ends in June of 2020. And I believe that has somewhat distorted this, probably to the positive side to some degree. But basically, we are seeing about 310, almost 310,000 missing households who have never sustainably came into being. And this is really quite a striking result, really, because the thing is that this is despite the fact that you're seeing more and more younger people not coupling up, more and more single person households in this demographic than perhaps there was previously, despite the fact that housing costs are higher. So it really is quite a mess. And not only that, there's also the factor that these people, when they calculate the home ownership rate for a given age demographic, it's only people who exist as their own individual household who get counted in terms of that calculation. If you're living with roommates or if you're living with mum and dad, you don't get counted in the home ownership rate statistics. So if you actually plug this into the same data set from the ABS for that particular period, it spits out a home ownership rate for the 25 to 34 age demographic of something like about 34.8%, I believe it was, or about 34%, which is significantly lower than the already bad deterioration that we've seen in that particular age demographic. So it really is quite sad because, basically you're talking about people who have just failed to launch. And I think there are consequences for that for all of us in society.
Well, one of the consequences I'm getting quite strongly now in my conversations, my one-to-one conversations, is that people in this age group are giving up on Australia. They're actually saying it is not feasible for us to stay and live in Australia and have that family and have that life that we aspired to. So some of them are actually deciding to jump ship and go to somewhere else where maybe housing affordability is a little easier. And that's a really worrying trend, because we've already highlighted that actually there's not a huge number to start with. If you then start seeing some of those deciding to leave and go elsewhere around the world, that's going to put extra stress on the ones that remain. And just to highlight again, we've got this intergenerational issue where you've got this big python-sized bulge at the moment, the older age groups, and they are going to hang around for another 20 odd years, give or take, which means that the economic pie has to be able to support those into their old age. And so you've got this shrinking group under huge pressure, overlaid against that massive bulge, which is still there. And of course, still has quite a lot of political clout too.
No, absolutely. I mean, this is something I got into like this time last year. I was in Asia, and I spoke to a bunch of different expats, people who lived in Thailand, people who lived in Japan, loads of different people. Just getting a feel for why. Why did they leave Australia? Why did they leave the West? Well, the Anglosphere, I should say. And I think one of the most important lessons that I took away from that was that it's all very much a personal choice. It's all very much about up to perspective. Now, you can look at Australia, you can look at our GDP per capita, and compare it with other nations, or our household disposable income per capita, and compare that with other nations, and say, oh well, everything's great here. Look at how high ours is with other nations. Everything should be great. You should want to be here. But that's not the way the world works. People have life pressures, like, for example, like you were saying, around issues like housing, around issues like being able to afford the kind of lifestyle that they want to have in order to raise a family. And those factors matter more to some people. So it is very much a very personal choice as to where you rank each nation. Because the thing is, every nation has problems. Like, say, for example, I know, I spoke to, I saw some people who they went to Japan, and obviously Japan has its issues. It has its own issues with demographic decline that we spoke about before. It's got its cultural issues. It's got issues with, say, for example, with how women in the workplace are approached after they've had children, all these different factors. But someone might look at Japan and say, well, it's cheaper. I can afford to have a family. It's safe. It's it's affordable more broadly. It gives me an opportunity to travel. All these different factors that I've heard from people, and yes, that is the place for me. Now, someone else who's perhaps more extroverted, or perhaps works in a more hands-on position that wouldn't rate that sort of level of income in a place like Japan, might look at it and go, well, no, that's the complete antithesis for me. I would much rather stay in Australia, or I'd much rather go somewhere else, or to the United States, or wherever. And I think that as we see more and more people consider that move and much more seriously look at these things, I think that we've got problems, because the thing is that the people who are going to move are the people who have the skills and the financial means to move. And those are the people that you really least want to lose.
Spot on. And as I said, I've had a couple of interesting one-to-one conversations recently with people, even looking at places like the UK, which in a way has a lot of the same issues. Although actually in parts of the UK, housing affordability is a lot easier than it is in Australia at the moment. And there's no one size fits all easy answer here, but the social consequences of the decisions that were taken and are being taken and will be taken follow through into all sorts of horrible consequences, not necessarily positive at all. Oh, and by the way, those very groups that we're talking about, under huge pressure from a housing perspective and from a family formation perspective, their income growth is also pretty diabolical too, isn't it?
It is indeed. Now, these numbers I lifted from a report from the Productivity Commission on real wages growth by age demographic. And what I've done when the scope of that particular data set ends in 2018 is I've just tacked on the standard real wages numbers from the ABS, just aggregate more broadly. Now, whether or not they're accurate for those particular age demographics, I doubt it. I'd say it's probably somewhat to the downside, but you take what you can get. And basically what this shows is that from 2008 to 2018, the 20 to 24 and 25 to 34 age demographic basically saw their real wages go more or less nowhere. Now, obviously, since inflation took off, they've gone and wages suffered for it during the pandemic in particular, they've gone backwards. But it just goes to show that people were going absolutely nowhere and things were already challenging and quite dire for this demographic prior to the pandemic. Because what this doesn't factor in is the impact of bracket creep, of the fact that people get pushed up, that as their nominal wages rise, even though their purchasing power has remained roughly the same, the slice of the pie taken by the government has gotten larger and larger and larger and larger. So in terms of disposable income, one can only really conclude that it's gone backwards. And I don't know about you, Martin, but I'm just going to just share this groundbreaking theory. I don't think that's terribly conducive for household formation or people having kids.
No. Well, it's fascinating that you talk about this because the analysis that I do always is real disposable income. In other words, after tax, when I look at my housing affordability metrics. And the implication on that is that it's the tax take that is a bigger impost on many households than the interest rate rises that we saw over the last 4 or 5 years, which is astonishing when you think about it, because of course rates were ultra low and then they went up. And that means, of course, now people were hoping that rates will come down, but of course the RBA is now suggesting that they have to put them up again. But it's the tax take, it's the additional tax that is being taken out from households, ordinary households, that actually are really, really hurting. And the trends are, despite, of course, Chalmers talking very strongly about, well, we're going to give more, tax back, etc., etc. No, the trends are, because of the bracket creep that still exists in the system, that people will be paying more and more into that bigger pot that the government then spends, a proportion of which goes things like NDIS and childcare. So they're trying to sort of put money back into the system. But I would argue that they would do a lot better to take less out of the system to start with and give more money to the households on day one so that they can spend it the way they want, rather than trying to do this weird circular movement through which, of course, they can, spend a lot more and make more decisions, etc., etc. And the other point, the wealth effect. Now, one of the things about Australia, that they say, well, you look at the wealth, look at how much wealth is there. Wow, everybody's got a lot of wealth. No, actually, it's a theoretical paper wealth based on the theoretical value of property if you own property. Now, that wealth is not, again, equally shared. And this very cohort, the one we're talking about, if you look at their average wealth holding, it's actually remarkably low relative to some of the other cohorts as well. So whichever way you look at it, these cohorts are really facing a huge uphill struggle. And it's actually because of the policies that have been in place for the last 20 to 30 years. So this is not something which is a happenstance. This is by design.
It is, and I think that that is one of the major problems with the current debate surrounding all of this, is because I don't think that the impacts of government policy are really as appreciated as they perhaps should be. Like for example, immigration, right? Why is it that the government and the people who support the government in their goals with regards to high levels of migration think that somehow that is not having a deleterious and negative impact on the people in the age demographics where most of the migrants coming in are at? So why is it that, we'll just go back to that slide with the in the growth by age demographic there. Why is it they think that 35 to 54 age demographic managed to get ahead while while the 20 to 34 age demographic fell behind? I'm gonna go out on a limb here, and I'm gonna say that that a major part of that was the fact that if you grow the labor supply in that same age demographic with people with similar skills, with people that we're even training at universities and at other private institutions to have those skills, that all of a sudden we have all these other people competing for the same jobs, and it suppresses wages, which is something that Phil Lowe has talked about. And kudos to him for saying that. That what basically happens, that if you grow the labor supply, particularly in certain demographics, at a rate that's so high, it, and I quote, dilutes the impact of wage growth pressures. And that's just something rather basic, basic supply and demand, like year 9 business studies level stuff that's obvious, that could be addressed, but doesn't get addressed because, well, then you take away one of the last remaining things propping up the economy along with government spending.
Yes, well, that's of course the issue. And when you actually measure the performance of the economy in terms of GDP and a couple of the other metrics that tend to get used, you mask a lot of really important stuff. The GDP per capita number, which of course is the real important number, but that takes you right back into the question of productivity and all of those things. And again, there's a lack of government focus, in my mind, on some of those critical issues. And again, it goes right back to what we said at the start of the show, that there's this gap between perception and reality. The reality is that a lot of Australians, as we've discussed here, are really up against it. And as I say, it is because of policy decisions that have been taken, not just by the current government, by earlier governments too. And I do actually sheet a lot of the blame right back to Howard and Costello, because, of course, then we had this huge income splurge thanks to the mining boom, and it was squandered. It wasn't actually used wisely. And that's the point, that there is a continued set of trends, again, to my mind, where government policy is about maximizing the opportunity of them winning the next election, maybe, but not actually laying the foundation for nation building and for long-term growth and development. And now we're seeing it all come home to roost.
No, and I think the problem is that what we've seen is basically the cascade effect of that repeated over time, over election cycle after election cycle. Now, when Howard and Costello pulled the migration lever for the first time in, 2004, 2005, and, migration started to surge dramatically above what had become the norm for, the Howard government, that obviously boosted, especially given the backdrop at the time, that boosted the tax take. It boosted their ability to deliver some of the various policies towards the end of the Howard government. And it also, did the same thing for Kevin Rudd. But the problem is that then the time comes when the policy is no longer serving its purpose, when it is starting to have either diminishing returns or flat out negative returns in terms of like per capita outcomes, where you need to turn it off. But the problem is that the cost for turning it off has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, because it's become such a greater and greater and greater component, because of the fact Now, this is where the very interesting analysis from Jared Minnack comes in, and if you've got the graphs, please whack them up, where basically what you end up with over time is you have less infrastructure, less capital, they call it capital stock, and it's growing by less and less over time, and it impacts the ability to grow productivity, to be able to have, things like wages growth and economic growth, for those to be robust, but not deliver inflation. And over time, that capacity and our capacity for productivity growth has been diminished and diminished and diminished because we've added all these people, but we haven't added the means by which to grow our productivity. And we haven't added the right people to be able to improve our productivity in particular with regards to those demographics. And that's something that even the Albanese government has admitted in, some of its various commentary on these issues. So you're left with this situation whereby if the Albanese government was to return migration to a level consistent with ending the rental crisis, with eliminating the housing deficit, and let's say 5 years, and let's even take the lower end estimates, you're still talking about migration cuts to the tune of at least cutting it back to under 100K a year for 5 years. Depending on how you see the severity of different things and, what particular analysis you choose to derive from. That's probably based roughly on the, just off the top of my head, on the KPMG analysis. So you get stuck with a situation whereby the cost to turn it off just gets larger and larger. In some ways, I liken it to a time bomb, except instead of just diffusing it, you diffuse it only to replace it with a bigger time bomb. And I suspect we're going to keep doing that for quite some time to come.
Well, I would argue there are two time bombs. One is the migration time bomb. The other is the housing affordability time bomb. And both of those are
Yeah.
ticking away, or as you say, getting replaced by even bigger ones, because the longer you leave the problem, the bigger the problem is. It's like if you've got a hole in your roof, you try and fix it on day one rather than leave it for a few years and then have to replace the whole roof, right? It's much more complicated to fix as you leave it. And I've been talking about this stuff for, I don't know, 20 odd years. I did my first survey in 2001, and I was worrying then about the trends in housing affordability and some of the migration stuff. This is a long-term problem. It's getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And those bombs, if they do go off, well, they are now, at a nuclear quantum, really.
That they are, and I think that just speaks to the need to address these issues in a way that can actually fix them, that can actually, even if it's something that's done over time, that there's actually just a plan. I mean, I think that what really needs to be said to the Australian public is that we've got ourselves in a big old mess, and just to be honest with people, I think that people appreciate that, because the reality is that this is going to blow up in our faces eventually, and the longer it goes, the worse it's going to get. I mean, if you look back on the ABS data on household spending, going all the way back to, I think it's 1984, that shows that back then Australians spent about 16% of their household. Is it either 16? No, I think it was 18% of their household income on housing and housing related things. At the latest data point, which was in 2015, 2016, before the data set was either paused or discontinued, I'm uncertain, it had risen to about 25 or 26%. So you've just got the housing monster sucking in more and more and more capital, more and more just income on a daily basis. And instead of that being spent into the economy, instead of people having smaller mortgages, instead of people being debt free and being able to start businesses and be productive, they've just got this millstone around their neck. And it's not good for the economy. And I can't help but look at some of the analysis coming out of America at the moment, even from the likes of the Federal Reserve and the like, talking about the drag from high household debt and high housing prices on the US economy. And the, Goldman Sachs put out an analysis late last year that showed that the median US house was 4.5 times household income in Australia, which is about where Australia's was in 2001. So your analysis that this is a problem, that this is a drag on the economy, was absolutely correct. I mean, you've got a plethora of people in the United States raising the alarm at the exact same settings. Yet here in Australia, the the median house now costs about 9 times household income. So what is ringing alarm bells in America is doubly worse here in Australia, and I would argue that that the impact as well is non-linear. It's not twice as bad as having a house at 4.5 times incomes. It's several times worse than that, because it's about how deviated it is from affordability, which is a whole lot larger than the double moniker would imply.
Yeah, well, that's spot on. And I talk about replacement spending. So if people are having to spend a lot more on just putting a roof over their head, whether it's renting or whether it's got a mortgage, that spending is replacing spending they would have done elsewhere previously. And that explains the economic downdraft that we've got at the moment. And by the way, private sector investment, which everyone's claiming to be booming, is almost exclusively connected with the data center AI boom rather than anything else. It's nothing to do with a lot of households. A lot of households have no capacity to spend anymore. And I'm minded to just touch on the shoe event horizon in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I'm not sure whether you're familiar with it, but there is an archaeologist in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy talking around the fact that if you went around planets, there will be a point where every shop would be a shoe shop. Nothing will be left but shoe shops. And then essentially the economy collapsed, and archaeologists could look back and see the shoe event horizon, right? I think we've got the housing event horizon. In other words, more and more of the economy is being sucked into housing and housing related issues, and less is going into other things. And ultimately, it will end up costing everybody. Now, whether it's going to be the end of society or whether it's not, I don't know. But the point is, these are decisions that were taken: deregulation of the financial system, changes to the tax breaks and bases, the lending multiples from the banks. I could go on, And at the end of the day, when you stand back and think about it, a lot of households know that it is a lot more uncomfortable now than it used to be, and it's really hard to get ahead than it used to be. These are the consequences of political decisions. These are consequences of decisions that were taken with full intent to do this to society. And that's the problem I have a real issue with. This is deliberate.
Yeah. Well, I've been reading through a bunch of different, policy analysis going back to, and even some old, newspaper articles, magazine articles, and stuff from the from the 40s, 50s, and 60s on housing policy, and you can't help but be struck by the approach from both sides to, we need to build more houses, we need housing to be more affordable, the property investors can get screwed, all these different things. Like, for example, like, by some metrics, by some analysis, the number of property investors in Australia, the number of properties owned by investors at the 1949 census was higher than it was in 1966, 17 years later. And that's despite the fact that Australia saw the absolute most stonking per capita growth in housing stock during that time. But did it go to investors? No. No, it went to owner-occupiers, and Australia's home ownership rate rose to its highest level in history. And despite the fact that 60 years has elapsed since then, we are worse off now in terms of home ownership outcomes than we were then. And despite the fact that we have this very successful set of policy books that both sides supported, and in some cases both sides wholeheartedly adopted. I mean, there are elements from the Labor side, from the Chifley government, which were wholeheartedly adopted by Menzies and his successors, and used as part of the policy for housing for Australia for over 20 years. And it's just ridiculous that we've got all these policies that worked, all these settings that worked, but we just pretend out. Well, we don't pretend. The politicians pretend that they don't exist. Like, say, for example, like the Menzies government was like, well, we've got too many people owning properties who are property investors. Okay, well, what are we going to do about it? Well, we're going to tilt the scales against property investors. We're going to make credit harder to get. We're going to say, and we're going to make credit easier to get for owner occupiers and first home buyers and people building homes. And well, what about them? Well, who cares about them? This is about the future of our country. This is about what Menzies called the foundation of a sane society. And who cares about all that other crap? This is about defeating communism. This is about social cohesion, about giving Australians a stake in our society. And that's exactly what they did. Yet our politicians just grope around in the dark, dumbfounded, unable to find the policy book room in Canberra where they could just dust all this off and do all the exact same things all over again.
Well, of course, the truth is that the banks are very big lobbyists, and the building sector are very big lobbyists. And if you look at the build to rent tax breaks that are now in, that again is not necessarily going to solve the fundamental problems. My point is, Tarek, this isn't that politicians don't know this stuff, but they choose to do different things. So I get very frustrated with the O'Neill doctrine, as I call it. Oh well, house prices can go sustainably higher. No. You've got no idea if that's what you really believe. But no, I'm not sure you really believe it. But it's a good soundbite, right? So we have to move away from sound bites, and we have to move away from short-term political stuff to these fundamental issues that we've been touching on today. Otherwise, well, folks, Australia potentially is doomed, unfortunately. And I suppose just from a sort of a contextual, as we go towards the end of the show, Tarek, talk about doom, we should just look at a couple of other angles on doom more broadly too.
Yeah, well, perhaps we should. Now, this is from the US, and it basically shows the growth in overall employment, the growth in healthcare and social assistance employment, and the growth in overall employment minus healthcare and social assistance. And as you can see there, the US economy has very much turned Australian in the last 12 months, because without the growth in healthcare and social assistance, total US employment growth would be negative. So, but it is important for a little bit of context here. In the US, during the pandemic, the level of healthcare and social assistance level of employment fell for over, I think it was a little over 2 years. US social assistance and US healthcare and social assistance employment was actually lower than its pre-pandemic total. So what we are seeing here in the US now is something of a catch-up, an actual catch-up, that they are now basically just catching up with the jobs that they previously would have had. And in terms of the longer-term trend for US healthcare and social assistance employment, it is roughly on the pre-COVID trend. Although I will add that even with these big numbers in US terms, if you compare it to the level of healthcare and social assistance employment growth in Australia over the same time, they are in two completely different galaxies, with Australia's being higher. More than in terms of the proportion of people in the labour force, but a fair bit more than double, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's worth highlighting, I think, that the recent wages data for Australia showed that some of the strongest growth was guess where it was, Tarek? Guess where it was?
Oh, I don't know, Martin. Maybe it was in healthcare and social assistance, and I'm going to go out on a limb and say another government-linked sector, mm, utilities.
Funny that. Yes, funny that. Oh dear. Yeah, and just to sort of re-emphasize what you just said, yeah, there was an uptick in the US, but that's not an uptick. If you want to see an uptick, look at Australia.
Yeah, exactly right. You know, we've seen this absolutely huge level of growth in, you know, the so-called non-market jobs, and I mean, I believe there was in the Senate estimates recently that the government was forced to concede that over, well, I think it was what, over 80% of the jobs growth in the last 12 months in the detailed
83.
ABS labor force. There you
83%.
go. Yeah, 83% was in government funded roles, and not only that, but that doesn't include the utility sector. If you include the utility sector on top of that, it gets a whole lot higher than 80. Well, not a whole lot higher, but it gets a fair bit closer to 100%.
Absolutely. Yeah, and just to emphasize what that means that the jobs that are being created are being paid for by taxpayers. I refer to our earlier conversation about the high tax take and the fact that the bans have been frozen and will continue to be frozen for some time. And so even ordinary Australians are paying actually a lot more tax than previously. And just to emphasize that at the aggregate level, at least, the growth in taxes has been stronger than the growth in interest repayments for those with more, if you look at the overall sort of story. So actually, it's the tax problem, the tax settings are one of the issues. And then just finally, we of course have got the other little sleeping issue. Oil prices started spiking quite dramatically. Folks, fill up quick. And there's a reason for that.
There is indeed. Now, this graphic shows the various US military assets in what they call the US Central Command, which is, you know, sort of around the Middle East and also in the adjacent areas. And this might, if for those who are very, very interested in this, it might be better off looking at this on my website where it's in full 4K glory, and you'd be able to see all the various different things in a little bit more detail. But basically, the current military buildup in around Iran from a naval and air asset perspective of the US military is the largest buildup since 2003, since the US invasion of Iraq. Now, it is important to emphasize that there isn't anything like the same level of ground troops and ground assets being committed to the region like there was in 1991 and again in 2003. But in terms of air assets, even things like some of the more sophisticated airborne early warning aircraft, a disproportionate number of those have all been committed to the region. So it is possible that we could see something rather serious kick off with Iran in the next few weeks, potentially as early as the weekend, by some reports. Now, I just want to go sort of just clarify something here. One, what we're talking about here is not necessarily what we want to happen. It's just about talking about what we think will happen. And more than that, I think that what we're going to see here is, and this is just obviously my opinion, is what we're going to see here is something not like the invasion of Iraq in 1991 or the attack on Iraqi forces in Kuwait in 1991. The US has the ability, and they showed this when they bombed the Iranians last time, and the Israelis went to town on them as well, that they have the ability to basically attack the Iranians, not quite with impunity, but to attack them without facing a major response in terms of loss of life and loss of material. Now, they of course can turn around and throw the kitchen sink, but realistically, their ability to respond without prompting an even greater level of hurt, shall we say, being thrown at them downrange is not that considerable. And that then leaves the question of what could the Americans do? They could potentially basically just hit the Iranians and keep hitting them, destroy infrastructure, destroy military assets, and basically just keep hammering them until such time as the government collapses. Now, if they end up hitting infrastructure as they did in Iraq, and they end up hitting it very, very hard, they could basically make much of Iran unlivable in terms of access to things like water and electricity and all these other essential things, and basically just force it in well and truly into failed state territory. Now, whether or not they're going to choose to employ that particular strategy, I don't know. But they have the assets, the air assets there to do that if they choose to. And, well, from what happens there is anyone's guess. I mean, the Iranians could end up being forced to fold, or they could turn around and they could mine the Strait of Hormuz as a an indignant, you know, big swing as they potentially go down. It's very much open to interpretation. And as I said, that's just my sort of read on things. It's not, you may have a different view as the viewers might.
Well, yes, it's certainly a big build-up. And interesting, the UK have refused to allow Fairfield in Gloucestershire and some of the other assets to be used by the US on the Iran situation, which is quite interesting. But I think this is one to watch, Tarek, because I sometimes talk about black swan events. Well, this now has the potential to be a very significant black swan event, which will have not just consequences in and around the Middle East, but absolutely more broadly. And I would remind everybody that Trump, of course, is facing a midterm election cycle shortly. And so perhaps appearing to be really strong and, big guy throwing his weight around, has some positive economic consequences for the US, maybe, but certainly positive electoral prospects for the US. And I just wonder whether there's in the background that angle too.
Well, I remember back during Trump's first term when there was all those issues in Syria with the Assad regime, and Trump pancaked a bunch of what I believe what people were saying were like chemical weapons labs and all that sort of thing. And he hit they did the whole Tomahawk cruise missile and all that sort of stuff strike. And I remember just watching the media, even the parts of the media who tend to not speak very favorably of Trump, speaking of very favorably of Trump's decisiveness, of, his employment of US military power. And while I think that there is a lot of concern out there amongst the American people in terms of the polling surrounding a potential conflict with Iran, I think that there is also people within the political apparatus who would be quite happy to see the Americans just turn around and just pancake the crap out of Iran's remaining military assets. And just, I mean, the thing is it really just depends on what exactly is their goal. Is their goal just to pancake them and just leave them as an example of, what happens when you mess with us? Or is the goal to, full-blown regime change? And maybe there's, forces working in the background that we don't know about that will potentially come to the fore if the Iranian, current Iranian ruling class is sufficiently weakened.
Absolutely. Well, I noticed the UN is extremely quiet on all of this at the moment, which I think is also an interesting observation, given perhaps their role previously in coordinating some of the responses to some other conflicts. So I think this is one to watch, Tarek. But as we come to the end of the show, boy, we've covered a lot of ground today. But as we said at the start, it looks a bit gloomy, doesn't it, at the moment? Let's hope that we can find some optimism, and let's hope that things don't go down the toilet. But it's not looking great.
No, and honestly, I would like nothing more than to be able to find some optimism and some hope that's grounded in reality and grounded in the data. And if there's any political party or political figure in Australia who wants to do that, I would be very glad to see it. Because frankly, I don't care who puts out the fire, just that it gets put out.
Hear, hear. Tarek, thank you so much. I look forward to chatting with you again down the track, and have a great weekend.
You too. Thanks, mate. You have a good one.
Cheers.